Well, welcome to a new edition of More Bad News, brought to you as always by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camel's Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days and see for yourself what a difference Camels can make in your life. Well, while Camels was America's most popular brand of cigarettes, my mom preferred menthols like Cools and Salem's. Now, Cools and Salem's were popular choice for women and African Americans. Since I was basically a bum and I would smoke whatever was available, I smoked menthols with my mom. The first cigarettes I ever smoked actually were stolen from my mom and secretly smoked out back in the chicken coop when I was 10 or 11. I've mentioned previously that I was the dead child walking, and that the angel of death was my guardian angel. And when I took it into my head that we should get chickens and build a coop in the backyard of our suburban house, my parents said, sure, why not? It was an undertaking doomed to failure, but while for a while I was able to sit in the back and smoke with my chickens. Now, menthol cigarettes were first promoted as a response to the growing concern over the health effects of smoking. Menthol was promoted as a way to soothe the airwaves of health-conscious smokers. Long used as an analgesic, menthol created a soothing, cooling sensation. By the early 1960s, tobacco companies had realized that there was a growing African-American market ready for exploitation. Ebony magazine welcomed tobacco advertisers, which featured Black models and the affirmation of Black consumer influence. It was nice to be noticed. When tobacco control advocates campaigned against cigarette billboards in the inner city, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People came out in defense of commercial free speech, arguing that it was racist to say that Black people were so malleable that they don't have the sense to decide whether to smoke or not. And when there was talk about banning menthol from cigarettes, influential Black leaders such as the Reverend Al Sharpton opposed the ban, arguing that it would result in an underground market and increase police action against Black smokers. And before you knew it, Cools had became extremely popular among Black smokers. So in my mind, Cools were associated with my mom and Blacks. By the way, that information comes from a new book, Pushing Cool, Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette. Yeah, it's a 2021 publication. Very interesting. Go check it out. Well, it's been another week of very bad news. The Republican primaries last week proved that the Republican Party is completely in the hands of the big lie. The big lie was introduced by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf in 1925 to describe the infamous theory that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but was stabbed in the back by the Jews. The Jews were to blame for all of Germany's problems, and the solution to Germany's problems was to eliminate the Jews from German life. Goebbels said, when one lies, one should lie big and stick to it. Keep up the lie, even at the risk of looking ridiculous. Goebbels went on to advise calling your enemies liars. In our case, the Republicans are rallying around Trump and the big lie that he won the 2020 election and is the subject of a vicious assault by the Democrats on Trump and the Republicans. Last week, I reported on the latest of the ongoing story of the approaching extinction of the ocean's phytoplankton. We know that for decades, the phytoplankton population has been in precipitous decline, at least 40% from 1950 to 2000. And most recently, we've seen that it's more than 50%. More than 50% of the phytoplankton in the ocean are gone. These tiny organisms gobble up carbon dioxide to produce half of the world's oxygen output, equaling that of the trees and the plants on the land. So half of our oxygen comes from the trees and half of our oxygen comes from the plankton, and the trees are on fire and the plankton are dying. I think it's ironic that we live in a golden age of history. Amazing work is being done in virtually every field of history. Without a future, it seems that history has really no use value. But it is apparent that history doesn't need to be a tool. It can be something that is just a pleasure and a delight. You remember that last week I spoke about an unpublished paper of mine describing the anti-Semitism in Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, 1741. I posted the article in 2012, and 10 years later, a wonderful graduate student at Keene University read it. That is the miracle of the internet. I didn't need to have thousands of readers. It just sat there. And when the right person came along to appreciate it. So a big shout out to Kira Dejot. I hope to update everyone on her research on anti-Semitism in colonial America in future editions of the show. For today, I just wanted to share a new book that she introduced to me. It's this one, the Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton by Andrew Porwancher, published by Oxford and Princeton University Press last year. Everyone knows that everyone knows Hamilton from the musical, but there was no hint that he was born a Jew or what his relationship to the Jewish community was. No one in all these years has thought it worthwhile to discuss the possibility that his father, Johann Levine, was Jewish and that Hamilton was educated in Jewish schools. Everyone just assumed that he was a Christian from birth. And would you believe that Professor Porwancher, I'm sorry, I don't have his pronunciation of his name correct, has been attacked for daring to assert that Hamilton was Jewish? It reminds me of the Jefferson family vehemently denying that Jefferson could have had children by his concubine, Sally Hemings. Well, how dare anyone suggest that Jefferson had a concubine? Of course, Sally Hemings was Martha Wales' half-sister, and by all accounts, there was a striking family resemblance. When Jefferson married Martha Wales, Sally joined the Jefferson household, and after Martha died, Sally took over the duties as matron of the household. She and her children were the only slaves that Jefferson ever freed. Still, his white descendants steadfastly refused to believe the oral history of the Jeffersons' black descendants until genetic evidence proved that Jefferson had indeed impregnated Sally when she was 14 years old. You remember, we started by saying that the history of colonial America was the history of the collision of three worlds, white, red, and black. And we began by talking about native peoples. And now what I want to do is to take a look at the African part of this story. And the following material really comes from a textbook by Jeffrey Nash, The American People, 2006. It was something that professors do a lot, which is, this is not really original research. I'm just telling you what I read. But it is enhanced by years of work in teaching, and this is my take on it. So first, the peoples of Africa supplied at least 2/3 of all the immigrants who came to the Americas after the Europeans began colonizing here. They came from a rich diversity of cultures, and but most of them shared certain ways of life that differentiated for Europeans. Now, the first thing, let me share my screen for a moment, and see, go share screen and share screen and share and bring this up. Okay, so let me just show you the map. I always did this with my students because it's important to understand that this is where Africans came mostly to America. Yeah, this is Egypt, and in colleges you see the black students often do, it's kind of like Egypt week or something. But this is really the origins of African Americans comes from West Africa, this region, and this is what I wanted to talk about a little bit more, that region of Africa. So, but to begin with, first, the estimated populations of Europe, Africa, and the Americas before the contact were about the same. In the 14th century, the African population was larger than the European population. Both Africa and the Americas experienced precipitous declines in population at the same time that the European populations were rising precipitously. By 1600, European populations had surpassed that of African populations, but the continents were still roughly comparable. In the Americans, the human population was mostly in the southern regions of the continent, less so in North America. But again, all three continents were roughly comparable in population, with perhaps 60 million in the Americas, 70 million in Africa, 80 million in Europe, something like that. And the population of Asia larger than all those combined. The Native American population would decline by over 90% with the European contact with the Europeans. Between 1700, and I should add that the African population would take an enormous hit of tens of millions of people because of the slave trade. Between 1700 and 1950, the population of white people spread across the world and exploded to a high point of about 25% of the human population. In other words, as Western imperialism began to take control of the world, European white populations were also expanding and became a larger proportion of the total world human population, reaching their peak in the 1930s, I think, at about 25%. Today, 10% maybe, 12%, something like that. So not surprisingly, as colonialism collapsed and white supremacy ended, the proportion of the human population of white people began to shrink. When white people fear that they are losing control, they really are justified. They are losing control. So before Europeans reached the west coast of Africa, a number of large empires had already existed there. The first was the Kingdom of Ghana, which was embraced a huge territory between the Sahara and the Gulf of Guinea, and it stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Niger River. Once again, I think probably a share would be helpful here, and I'll show you the map. So there it is. This is where Mali would be. This is the Niger River. It's the largest river, longest river, I think, in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And there, so there was a thriving caravan trade with Arab peoples across the Sahara to the Morocco and Algeria and the Middle East. By the 11th century, the King of Ghana boasted an army of 200,000. You think of George Washington's army at Georgetown, a combined army of French and Americans of 17,000. The King of Ghana had a standing army of 200,000. He maintained trading contacts as far as east as Cairo and Baghdad. He furnished, through Muslim middlemen in North Africa, 2/3 of the gold supplied to Christians in the Mediterranean, and the first gold supplied to Europe. The Islamic Kingdom of Mali came next. From the early 11th century until the 16th century, the city of Timbuktu was famous as one of the greatest universities of the time. Scholars from all over the world came to Timbuktu to study. Traveling there in 1330, the Arab geographer Ibn Battuta claimed that it's just a wonderful place. You're totally safe on the roads. I mean, you don't have to worry about bandits, and so women walk around wearing these gold jewelry on them, and without any fear. The place is really well governed, but not only that, but they had indoor plumbing. I mean, so it was just a very modern place, and way before Europe. So what you have is Europe will rise, but the relationship in the year 1000 between Africa and Europe is that Europe is really backward and being hit by these plagues, constantly draining their population. In this period that we're talking about, European population is growing by leaps and bounds, and the Enlightenment has given the Europeans the power really to travel around the world and to conquer. As in Europe, the family was the basic unit of social organization in Africa. Unlike European societies, however, African societies were organized in a variety of kinship and political systems. In many African societies, like many Native American ones, the family was matrilineal. Property rights and political inheritance descended through the mother rather than the father. As with the Iroquois, a man married and moved in with his bride's family. So, and that is a very effective way of protecting young brides. West Africans believed in a supreme creator, basically, and in lesser deities associated with natural forces such as rain, fertility, and animal life. And because of these deities could intervene in human affairs, they were elaborately honored, like most American Indian societies. West Africans held that there were spirits in the trees and the rocks and the rivers, and you had to respect the trees and the rocks and the rivers. You can't rape the land. That's what happened in Deadwood. Is these miners came and they raped the land, destroying everything in order to get out the gold. You couldn't do that because the land itself was sacred. You had to respect the water. You had to respect the rocks. Africans also worship their ancestors, and I want you to know that at Ferris State University, we interviewed a historian who came from West Africa, from Liberia, and I asked him about this, and he said absolutely. He always thinks about his ancestors before he comes in. He's always trying to make his father, particularly his father and his grandfather, but more generally his ancestors, proud of him. And he keeps that in mind as he goes about his daily business. It's a good way of living. There were slaves in African society, and there were slaves in Native American society. But the slavery that was there, the slaves had rights. They had opportunities for advancement. They were members of the community. They were entitled to protection under the law. They were allowed privileges of education, marriage, and parenthood. Their servile condition was not permanent, and it was not automatically inherited by their children. So it was really very different than what became the kind of slavery, racial slavery, that was developed by the modern capitalist corporation on the plantations of the Americas. That was a really brutal form of slavery that we hadn't seen before. That's not the slavery that existed throughout history. The conventional accounts of the beginning of American history ignores the themes of capture, constraint, and exploitation, but they are a significant part of the narrative. Indeed, by 1619, when the first 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown, over 500,000 Africans had already been forcibly shipped to the New World in Spanish and French Caribbean ships to French and Spanish islands, sugar plantations. Since many more Africans than Europeans made the Atlantic transit in the 17th and 18th centuries, it's difficult to reduce the story to the margins, or even to call it an unfortunate exception to the beginning of the story. By 1820, in fact, 5 times more Africans than Europeans had come to the Americas. This means that slavery is central to American history, and it also means that the history of the Americas cannot be a story solely of white colonizers and immigrants. And that's it for this week. I'm not sure that there will be a show next week. I've got surgery on Thursday, but I have this, I do want to come back to Sinners and do something about that. And I just might slip that in this week and get it out before the surgery. We'll see. If not, this will be it. And I'll see you, if not next week, the week after next for sure. Nothing's going to keep the show. The show must go on. So that's it. Have a good week. Bye-bye.